welcome to the Unstoppable Freedom Podcast. I'm Jimmy Page. Today, we're going to take a hard look at the legal landscape in America and how recent decisions are directly affecting our individual liberties. In case after case, it seems that our local and state governments are becoming increasingly hostile to people of faith, but because of great legal representation from our friends at First Liberty Institute, people of faith are winning and religious liberties are being protected and preserved. You need to know that. And we need to know that we're winning. We need to know that we have to start openly exercising our religious freedoms if we want to, quote, as I would say, save the culture. Well, our guest today is an expert in protecting and defending religious liberty, and he's also passionate about communicating with the faith community and empowering them to actually live out the religious freedom in the public square. His name is Jeremy Dys. He's the senior counsel for First Liberty Institute, the largest legal organization in the nation, dedicated exclusively to defending religious liberty for all Americans. They believe that every American of any faith or no faith at all has a fundamental right to follow their conscience and live according to their beliefs, both privately and publicly. Jeremy, welcome to the podcast.
Thanks so much for having me.
You bet. We've got a lot to cover today. And, I kind of set it up in the intro that, part of what I want to do today is talk about how legal precedent is changing and why that's important. And then ultimately, let's talk about a bunch of these cases that really do matter to our audience. I mean, these are cases that have gone all the way to the Supreme Court in many cases. Some of them have been settled before that, but they're setting religious freedom in new ways. They're moving the bar a bit. And I think we have more religious freedom now probably than ever from a legal perspective, but nobody knows it. It doesn't feel like it. It feels like we're getting beat up. Let's talk a little bit about that. You've said this. We've never had more religious freedom protection legally in our history. What do you mean by that?
Well, I think what I've said is that we've not had this much religious freedom in our lifetime. I think when the founders founded this country, we probably had the maximum amount of religious freedom, but that got curtailed over time by activist judges and politicians that were intent on consolidating power to their own ends. And so really, most of my lifetime, I turned 45 last year. And so there are a lot of cases that happened at the tail end of what we call the Warren Court in the late 60s and 70s.
Yes.
That really removed a lot of the core freedoms that we had come to value as a society in this country, among them free exercise of religion. And there are two precedents that occurred right around the years I was born. Actually, they bookended me, 1977 and 1979. Those are no longer good law. We've gone to the Supreme Court in two different cases, one from 1970, or a case that overturned a case from 1977, and another one that overturned a case from 1979. Those have all happened since 2022.
Wow.
And because of that was Coach Kennedy's case and Gerald Groff's case. I think we've talked about at least one of those here. But because of those overturnings, because those cases are now off the books and are no longer good law, well, we've gone and taken back territory towards freedom that we haven't had in decades. And so it's understandable that the American people would, having grown up with this sort of thumb on top of your religious freedom, would now not sort of know what to do with it. Maybe the different analogy is better. We haven't exercised that religious freedom muscle in 45 years.
Wow.
And so that muscle has atrophied. Well, I think you and I can send this message to everybody watching. Well, it's time to hit the gym again and get those muscles strengthened once more. You've got access to all those machines. You've got access to a personal trainer to go out there and build that freedom muscle one more time. And it just falls to you to go and truly exercise that muscle of freedom, the free exercise of religion in particular.
I love that. We have atrophied, right? We've atrophied in our ability to bring our faith to the public square, to exercise that religious freedom. In fact, I think it's worse than atrophy. I think we actually, number one, we had bad law, right? Bad precedent all the way at the Supreme Court. We had Lemon versus Kurtzman, and that's been overturned. But we had bad law. But the other thing we bought into, I think, and even in the religious circles, is that your faith is private, not public. I mean, it's total nonsense. Even our founders would have said, you do not check your faith at the public square door. You bring it everywhere. It informs everything that you do. And help us to exercise that, right? Help us to break through that barrier that your faith is not private, that it's intended to be public.
Well, that thinking really stems from this mistaken notion that the rights that we possess, including our religious freedom, are beneficent gifts from government. That's not true. And in fact, we need to look only to the Declaration of Independence to find out precisely why that's not true. And our Declaration says that these rights come to us at our creation. They were, as it says, endowed to us by our Creator. And these certain unalienable rights, meaning they cannot be taken from us. Why? Because they are part of who we are as creatures of a loving God. If God has given us these rights, then no man can take them. He's the only one that can actually remove them from us. And he hasn't shown any signs of wanting to do that lately. So if that's the case, then it's the government's duty to protect those rights. That's where the First Amendment of the Constitution comes in, to say, look, we've given up a lot of other rights. Among them, the right to form a more perfect union, for instance, right? Our laying a navy, putting it together an army, having the three branches of government. All those things are necessary in a social compact in a democratic republic like we have. Yeah. But the First Amendment goes back to that Declaration of Independence and says, hey, we didn't give up these rights. And the Bill of Rights is an explanation of the rights that we did not give up. And so we possess the rights to religious freedom at our creation, and we maintain them against the government's efforts to remove them. And so it's right and proper for us as American citizens who are a free people and have been for 200 and some odd years since its founding, to remind the government every time it tries to tinker around with our religious freedom that they got no business here. And the way that we settle that issue is by taking the government to court to remind them that you've gone too far. You've gone beyond the social compact. You've gone past the agreement, the contract we signed with you in the Constitution. We didn't say that you could have our religious freedom, and now you've questioned that. And so now we have to take you to court and remind you of your proper governing authority. And thankfully, when we do that, we've had great success.
It is truly a miracle because, we've seen the makeup of the court change over many decades. This may be a more conservative court than we've seen in a long, long time. And by conservative, I mean adhering to the basic tenets of our structure in America, our government, our freedoms, that these protections of our freedoms, these rights are given by God. Like you said, I think what is going to be required today to take back this ground, like you've said, we've taken back the legal ground. Now the question is, can we take back the experiential ground? Can we take back the culture, so to speak? And the question is, it's going to take courage for people to do it because we're afraid. We've been afraid for 45 years to bring our faith to the public square. And now we're saying, no, it's okay. You can do it. And everyone's like, are you sure? Are you sure? And I think now it's going to take courage now, today, more than probably in my lifetime, for sure.
Yeah, look, I hate to say it this way, but we as lawyers have done our part, and now it falls to everybody else to do their part. And I'm one of them too. I'm a citizen too, so I get to do my part as well. But we've gone out and we've taken the beachhead, and we've won back the freedoms that you wanted to have, and that you're required to have, or you're at least allowed to have under the Constitution. Yes. So we've restored those freedoms, and we've kicked open the doors to the gymnasium. Go to the gym, start pumping iron and getting those muscles back in shape again. And what I want to encourage in that is really two things. One is the challenge to go and exercise the freedoms that you have, because if you don't exercise them, they atrophy and die, and we have less freedom. We don't want less freedom. We want more freedom. But the second thing I want to say on that is a bit of comfort. So one is a challenge, and two is the comfort. The comfort is that if in the exercise of your religious freedom, you have someone question you about that, I want you to understand that we're winning these cases. Yes. And so I've at one time, as lawyers, we've opened the doors for your religious freedom. We've restored that religious freedom for you. Yes. But we don't leave you alone on that. That if in the exercise of your religious freedom, you get pushback on that, well, there's more freedom to be gained, and we're happy to defend that freedom, and where we can, expand it to the ideal that the Founding Fathers outlined for us in the First Amendment. So I challenge you to go exercise those freedoms. And I comfort you with the knowledge that if you are challenged on that, you need to only call First Liberty Institute at firstliberty.org, and we'll help you out.
Yes. And who would have thought that, attorneys don't always have the best reputation, right? And I think part of it's because, and this is not a knock, but it's part of his, none of us want to have a need for an attorney, to be honest. I mean, I don't ever want to have an attorney, but thank God for attorneys through First Liberty who are available, who are ready, who are winning big time, who understand constitutional law way better than the opposition. And we're getting these wins. We're bursting open the doors. And you're right. So let me ask you this. There's real heroes out there that have been willing to contact you all and take their cases to maintain our religious freedom as far as they need to go. And that's not without sacrifice all the time, right? I think about Coach Kennedy and others. Talk a little bit about the heroes that have been willing to do that, to sacrifice for these greater wins so that all of us can enjoy the blessings of liberty.
We're going to run out of time if I got to talk about all the heroes, because I've been doing this now for a decade, and all the clients we've been able to work with over the last 10 years, they're all, in my book, they're heroes. Why? Because they didn't go looking for a fight. The fight came to them. But they didn't shrink away from that battle. Coach Kennedy is a great example of that. Here's a guy who, he went looking for fights all his life, right? He fights in junior high, fights in high school, fights in the military. But, once he got out and his fighting days were over, he was trying to be a peaceful guy, just coaching a football game. And then the fight came to him. Well, he's not exactly a guy to back down from a fight. And certainly he didn't by standing up for your religious freedom, by taking a knee on a football field. And he did that for 7 years, fighting at the Supreme Court even to win that back. And he won. So we know that story. There's guys like Gerald Groff, who is a little lesser known, but is a really important case. Gerald is a very humble postal worker. He's very convicted about honoring the Sabbath day and keeping it holy. And so when the United States Postal Service took a contract with Amazon that forced their postal workers to carry mail on Sundays, he politely declined that offer and said, look, could you please work with me to find another? I'll work any other day. I'll work Saturdays. I'll fill in for people's shifts that have to work on Sunday. I'll work holidays. And he did. But, don't make me work on a Sunday. And they tried to accommodate that, but then ultimately they told him that, no, you have to show up. Here's the thing. If he had just worked 2, maybe 3 Sundays, he would have had enough seniority to schedule himself off on Sundays. But he couldn't compromise his faith on that point. And so he worked to try to find accommodation. They wouldn't. And so they ultimately they made life so miserable for him, he had to remove himself from the Postal Service. Amazing. But that case went to the Supreme Court and undid a case from the 1970s again that has had a massive impact upon religious freedom in the workplace. Well, that case is no longer good law. It's got a big red flag next to it in the legal search engines. And now what employers have to do when it comes to conflicts between the workplace and one's faith, they actually have to engage in a meaningful dialogue with the employee to figure out a way to accommodate. In other words, everybody from the boardroom to the mailroom now have to work together to come to an accommodation of a religious employee's beliefs. What does that mean practically? Well, look, there's a lot of dialogue right now about DEI, the sort of tolerant woke agenda that is being pushed, especially within the businesses. And you all know what I'm talking about already. There's all kinds of DEI trainings that take place. That, look, we've had lots of calls at First Liberty from employees saying this stuff is horrible. It offends me from a religious perspective. I don't want to have to be told to sit through it all. They're trying to root out my religious freedom. They're trying to root out my religious beliefs. And they even identify me in these trainings as a person of targeting, right? So that if I go to them and I object, I could lose my job. Well, here's the good news for you. Because Gerald Groff took his case to the Supreme Court, now even in those trainings, you have the right to sit down with your employer and say, look, what you're going to push over here is offensive to me. I'm happy to go through whatever diversity training you want us to go through, so long as it is truly diverse. Perhaps you'd be willing to engage in a dialogue with me as well to contribute my diversity to this training as well, or find at least an alternative for me to go through without jeopardizing my job. So Gerald's case really is kind of the woke killer in the employment context. It requires now the CEOs and the HR managers that have been pushing this DEI garbage inside the businesses to actually sit down with people of faith and say, okay, we get it. We recognize that this offends you, or at least causes you to have to compromise your beliefs. And the Supreme Court has told us we have to sit down with you to figure out an alternative for you. How can we help? That's the kind of dialogue we're looking for in this country.
This is so earth-shaking, seriously, because the DEI and the CRT, that whole racist ideology, which is permeating everything from our schools all the way down to our elementary schools, all the way up to as you said, the boardroom in all these companies. I know I have family members that have been mandated through these trainings, and they say they are the most racist, divisive trainings they've ever been through. They separate you, they embarrass you in the rooms. And if you speak up, you are immediately seen as someone who's intolerant, and you're ostracized. And in many cases, like you said, you'll be fired. I know this is going to encourage people to be able to stand up and say, hey, wait a minute, I object. And we need to find an alternative. This should embolden people across all employment sectors to be able to take a stand and say, this violates my religious freedom. This violates my values and my beliefs. Let's find an alternative. I'm super encouraged by that, because I have people that listen to this show are business owners, they're employers, and they're concerned about complying with this DEI nonsense. Does this give them a platform to, number one, not offer DEI training and to offer an alternative? What's the exposure for the ownership groups?
Well, I'll give you the famous law professor answer on that one, which is it depends. But largely, yes, we've expanded freedom because of these cases. And if there's more freedom, then there's more freedom for these employers to respect the religious beliefs of their employees as well. Look, that should be the responsibility of every employer and the privilege of every employer to figure out how to run their own business according to their own conscience and the marketplace that will support it. And so, yes, if an employer wants to offer some sort of diversity training, they're welcome to do so, so long as their employees will tolerate that and respect it, and the marketplace will support their social goals. But if they have a religious conviction against it, and there's a government regulation, for instance, that's requiring it, well, there may be some room for those employers to challenge it. But I think what's really important here is that this gives cover for those employers to be able to respect the religious beliefs of their employees. And so no longer do they have to feel cowed to the reigning woke CRT diversity agenda. They can actually engage in a meaningful discussion of diversity and equity and inclusion, or whatever the latest buzzwords are for the workplace. They can actually respect the religious beliefs of their employees by providing appropriate diversity training for everyone. And it also, and I think this is actually a great little benefit for our country, it invites everybody into the discussion, far left and far right and everybody in the middle. They can come together and have an actual melting pot kind of a discussion to figure out how do we get along with one another. Isn't that the real goal here anyway?
Right. I mean, gosh, it used to be, right? I remember growing up in school where I didn't know the political ideology of my teacher. I didn't know their sexual preference. I didn't know their lifestyle choices. We never knew any of that nonsense because it wasn't germane to elementary, middle school, and high school conversations. So I think what this also does is it may just kind of pull back the indoctrination, this push of this particular ideology. It gives us the ability to contest it in a respectful way so that we can all start getting along again.
At the bottom line, it gives the opportunity for the discussion and the freedom to recognize that not everybody agrees with the reigning popular issue today, and that there's a requirement under our Constitution to respect those who disagree with the mainstream thought. And that's been a wonderful thing of our country since its founding, that it welcomes everybody to compete for the best idea, which requires having more speech and not less. And so those policies that have suppressed speech and suppressed religious beliefs and expression for so long, with those out of the way and gone, we can actually pursue the ideal that our founding fathers wanted for us, which was to bandy about good ideas and bad ideas so that the best ideas come to the fore. And we can understand this idea of capital T truth, the thing that is really most meaningful in our lives anyway.
Yes. One of the things that's become more high profile recently, probably because of some issues with airlines, is this idea that we're hiring based on DEI. We're hiring based on diversity, equity, inclusion. We're not considering as so much the qualifications, the experience, the skill level, et cetera. And there has been a push. There's no question. I've seen it in many organizations that I've worked with. There are many cases that are now addressing this, right? We've got the Alaskan Air employee. I know you're familiar with this case where they fired an employee for her beliefs. Tell us a little bit about that and why we can be encouraged by the new trends.
Yeah, every time I hear a story about Alaska Airlines having a physical problem with their planes, I sort of chuckle because, if they're treating their employees the way that they've treated their flight attendants in our case, then it's really no wonder that the safety ratings are a little bit lacking at Alaska Airlines. Because here's what they did to these flight attendants is that they had a messaging board, sort of like a Facebook, but inside of the organization itself. That they passed out a link to a story about the latest diversity initiative or a bill that would support that in Congress, and invited conversation. And so our clients weighed in and they gave their unfiltered thoughts about that. They were very respectful in how they expressed it, but they expressed that they would be opposed to that. Why? Because that would question their religious beliefs and make them more of a target within the work environment itself.
Wow.
And for doing so, even though Alaska Airlines wanted them to come back and provide answers, but because they did that, well, they lost their jobs. Well, that seems, number one, just sort of rude. I mean, if you're going to invite someone to have a conversation, then why would you fire them for something you don't like? That doesn't seem fair or polite at all. But it also happens to be woefully illegal that you're targeting people and terminating them based upon their religious beliefs and their religious perspective. Well, that happens to be illegal under Title VII of the Civil Rights Act of 1967. You can't fire somebody or hire them based upon their religion.
Wow.
And so we've been engaged in litigation with Alaska Airlines for a couple of years now. Just recently filed our motion for summary judgment, and I hope that the court will recognize the requirements of the law and apply that against Alaska Airlines and provide some meaningful justice for our clients.
Yeah. Yeah, and I think that's why we have to show up, and that's why First Liberty is so important, because, without the legal voice, there'd be no remedy for this. There would be in fact, we never would have heard about this case or this situation if it wasn't for First Liberty, for this idea that every American citizen who believes their rights are being violated has a resource, has people that are willing to fight all the way to the Supreme Court and not give up. So I think, that's part of this story is we want to connect our listeners to you that are having their rights infringed upon. And there's so many of these, right? But let's talk about a handful of more cases that I think matter to the audience, right? Let's talk about Dad's Place. Let's talk about this idea of what this church is doing and how the government is actively engaged against its own community members.
I'm so glad you brought this case up. It's one of my favorite cases I've worked on in a decade because, I'm really good at punching people in the face, legally speaking, and I don't actually do that. But,
I don't know. My money's on you. You know, that bald head. I think you're tough.
I'm kind of I'm a blunt instrument, and praise God for it. But this is a great place that does ministry very well. They care for people extremely well. And God's equipped me to do a lot of things. Loving on people is maybe one of the lesser good things that I do. Yeah. But Chris Avell, the pastor of Dad's Place, is one of the most loving people I've ever met. Wow. And he noticed that there's a real problem in Bryan, Ohio with homelessness. People were living in their cars, living in dumpsters, sleeping on the streets, freezing to death, literally in the middle of the winter. Wow. And so he opened this church right off the town square in Bryan, Ohio, the town of the Etch-a-Sketch and the Dum Dums Lollipop. Wow. And the city, after a time, really didn't like that. Why? Because his business model, or I guess you call it a business model for a church, his model of ministry anyway, was a little different than being open from 9 to 1 on Sunday morning and 6 to 8 on Wednesday nights. Yeah. He decided that they would leave the church doors open 24 hours a day, and they would engage in 24 hours of ministry. What does that look like? Well, like a regular church, they have services on Sunday morning. They have Sunday school. They have Bible studies throughout the week. They've got different types of Bible studies all throughout the week where they're training people of what it means to live as a person of faith, as a follower of Christ. And they're also training them in practical skills that sort of develop from those presuppositions of religion. But then also they have at I think it's 11 o'clock at night, they turn off or they dim all the lights in the building. And Johnny Cash comes on the speaker. And they call this their rest and refresh in the Word ministry. And so Johnny Cash comes on reading the Bible at 11 p.m. and it turns off, I think, like 7 a.m. or something like that. Maybe he's all the way through. So there are people that will be there overnight at times and listening to and meditating upon the scriptures being read by the man in black.
Wow.
It's a unique ministry. Well, the
Wow.
city of Bryan didn't like that so much, and they came after Pastor Avell, who's just trying to do a good work up there.
Mm.
They initially filed 18 charges, criminal charges against him. We fought back against that. We've now had those dismissed, so he isn't facing any more jail time. But we had to file a federal lawsuit against the city of Bryan, Ohio, to remind them that they have to respect the use of property, the use of land for religious organizations like he is there in Bryan, Ohio.
Wow.
And so that suit keeps on going. But for the time being, people are not being kicked out onto the street in the middle of winter in Bryan, Ohio, having to fend for themselves. I think Bryan has done a good job of moving things in the right direction.
Yeah.
But we're continuing to work with the city there. I hope we can just simply dismiss the lawsuit and they can become great partners with Dad's Place of caring for critical members of their community. I think it's a very innovative strategy that they ought to be getting behind there in Bryan. And I think they're slowly coming around to realize how important that is to their community. And so the future remains, I think, bright. Maybe I'm very optimistic on that point, but I'm certainly not willing to dismiss that lawsuit quite yet until we've got clear assurance that they're going to be respectful of this little tiny church in the middle of a bunch of cornfields in Bryan, Ohio.
Well, thanks for tuning in to part one of a two-part series with senior counsel Jeremy Dys with First Liberty Institute. Stay tuned for a second part where we're going to give you more practical ways that you can exercise your religious freedom in the public square. See you next time.